Hello everybody, Theophilus the Historian here. Today I would like to take a look at the life and times of the Byzantine Emperor Theophilus. Theophilus reigned between 829 and 842. He was young, charismatic, well-liked, and after his untimely and early death, he was someone who was the subject of quite a bit of legend-making and storytelling. He was not forgotten in the chronicles, and his popularity continued for quite some time. Today I'd like to explore the man, the myth, and the legend that is Theophilus. And I think what we'll see is that he's someone whose reputation outstripped his actual accomplishments, but he was still someone who was deeply respected in his own time and afterwards, which is why I think that he is the closest thing that the Byzantine Empire had to a John F. Kennedy. So, without any further ado, let's look at Theophilus in greater detail. At the time of his death in 842, Theophilus was 38 years old, which means that he must have been born in or around the year 804 CE. His father was the future Emperor Michael II the Amorian. At this time, Michael was nowhere near the throne, and he was probably involved with the usurpation of Bardanes Turcus, which of course failed. So, we don't know exactly where Theophilus would have spent his earliest years. At some point, he would have presumably spent a good deal of time in the family's ancestral home at Amorium, pictured here, the ruins at least of it. Later, when his father became emperor, Theophilus had John the Grammarian as a tutor. John was someone who was one of the key scholars of his day, and he would later go on to be an advisor and functionary for Theophilus when Theophilus eventually became emperor. When Thomas the Slav was laying siege to Constantinople in 821, Theophilus was a teenager. He would have been about 16, and he led a solemn procession with the fragments of the True Cross and the robe of Virgin Mary along the land walls to try to bolster the morale of the defenders of the city. Most likely, he was selected to accompany these holy relics because his father was somewhat sullied by the fact that he had presided over murdering his predecessor on the altar at Christmas. At any rate, in 822, Michael decided to crown his son Theophilus as co-emperor, so technically this is when Theophilus' reign began. And it looks like he took a relatively active part in government, despite the fact that most co-emperors who are the heirs apparent don't really do all that much. In 829, Michael passed away, and Theophilus took power in his own name and by himself. By this point, he was 25 years old, and he already had several years of experience under his belt, so he was better qualified than most new emperors that we've looked at so far. Before we delve any deeper into Theophilus' reign, I would like to pose a couple of questions that I see as sort of underlying everything that's going on in his reign. Because if you think about the way that his reign is portrayed, it's actually a little weird. So, we know that Michael the Amorian and his wars had been expensive, and that he had had a great deal of trouble funding the naval expeditions to aid Crete and Sicily when they came under attack in the second half of his reign. Yet, Theophilus seems to be rolling in the dough. Well, why is that? How is this possible? My guess, and again, I don't really have much to back this up, is that the Byzantines were able to reopen and reacquire the Macedonian gold mines, which had funded the wars of Philip and Alexander. I assume that the gold veins were still active at this time and hadn't been completely tapped out. I don't actually know. And we also know that during the time of Nicephorus I, that the Byzantines had reacquired a lot of land in the Balkans, so perhaps this was the source of that wealth, or maybe they found another source somewhere else, or maybe it was simply being able to collect taxes from all of these new territories in Europe. I don't know. At any rate, apparently the wealth situation in the Byzantine Empire changed rather dramatically and rather quickly when we change between Michael and Theophilus in 829. Also, Theophilus was extremely popular and well regarded in the sources, and that's despite the fact that militarily he presided over more failures than successes. And also, another thing that's weird about him is that he was an iconoclast who presided over an active persecution. And normally the sources are extremely iconodual. They're extremely in favor of icon use, since icons won out, as you might be aware. And they tend to really hate any emperor who was against icons. So for instance, Leo III, Constantine V, all of those guys really get bashed in the sources, but for whatever reason, Theophilus doesn't get bashed, and he's seen as a really good emperor. Why is that? Well, possible answers: he had great PR. We'll see that there are plenty of stories and anecdotes about how just Theophilus was, and maybe these stories were put about to really bolster his reputation, and they really took hold. He also might have just done a really good job of attending to the needs and wants of the city population, which would have included a whole lot of literate people, and maybe that really impacted the way that he was viewed by posterity. And also because he died prematurely, there could be what I would call the JFK effect, where everyone wonders, well, he was on the path to greatness, and I wonder how high he could have soared if he would have had the chance. So maybe he's been given more benefit of the doubt than he would have had he died at an older age after having not quite tapped out his full potential. And the other thing he has going for him is that he was bookended by some serious chaos. His father came to power under some really unsavory circumstances, fought a brutal civil war, and then lost some of the empire's outlying possessions to Muslim renegades. Theophilus didn't preside over anything quite that embarrassing. And if we look at the reign of his son and successor, that was also something of a shit show, at least once he came of age. So, by comparison, Theophilus looks kind of good. And maybe between those factors, this is why Theophilus became such a legend. Theophilus was quite a bit different than other Byzantine emperors who came before him and most of the ones who came after him. And I think that we have to be aware of that before we try to look at the events of his reign. Theophilus was an Arabophile. He was fascinated with Arab culture from a young age, and one of the people he modeled himself after in a conscious fashion was actually the late Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid, who had died when Theophilus was just a boy. Theophilus also picked up the habit of wandering the city dressed as a poor man, something that Harun al-Rashid supposedly did, and he would do this in order to really keep the pulse of the city and judge the public mood. This is something that is often attested with a lot of popular rulers, so it's not a completely unique thing, but it's also something that is not all that typical. When he would travel to church every week, Theophilus made the time to take a circuitous route in order to allow citizens to approach him. So he'd take a really roundabout way around the city, cover most of the streets, and this would give citizens more chances to approach him with any problems that they might have. And he apparently was very willing to listen to those problems, and he had a reputation for addressing problems that were legitimate. While he received training in military affairs and showed flashes of ability, he was never more than just competent. So he sometimes has drawn comparisons with Heraclius, but he never showed anything like Heraclius's judgment or grit or ability to take a huge risk and make it pay off. So we shouldn't get too carried away by the fact that he triumphed twice, since of course Byzantine emperors could award themselves their own triumphs. Another chief characteristic of Theophilus, which may have stemmed from his love of the Abbasid court and a lot of their rituals, is that he was really in love with opulence and spectacle. And perhaps it was the grandeur of his spectacle, the way that he presented himself as magnificent, which really took hold of the public imagination and helped to build up the legend of Theophilus. So, without any further ado, now that we kind of have a grip on who we're dealing with and the questions that underlie his entire reign, let's now jump in and talk about what happened. When he ascended to the sole rulership of Byzantium, Theophilus was 25 and a bachelor. So one of his first priorities was to find a wife and to sire heirs to continue on the empire after he was dead. And to that end, his stepmother, the Empress Dowager Euphrosyne, decided to hold a bride show, which is something that her own grandmother, the Empress Irene, had more or less invented. And this bride show was held in May of 830. Of all the bride shows that we hear about, this is probably the most famous and best attested, or at least one of. One of the contestants, ultimately unsuccessful, was a female poet named Cassia. And she was supposedly extremely beautiful, and later went on to become a saint in the Orthodox tradition. Apparently, Theophilus said something to her, and her reply was wittier than what he had said. It intimidated him a bit, and he ended up choosing someone else. Then again, the account was written by the church, and they always have to make all of their saints superhuman in some way, intimidating, beautiful beyond belief, etc. So how true the story is an open question. At any rate, though, Cassia went on to become a nun and a church poet, and a lot of her verses, or at least some of them, are still in use in Byzantine liturgy. The winner of the bride show was Theodora, and she would be both the empress of Theophilus and the mother and regent of the future Michael III. Another move from the earliest days of Theophilus's reign was when he sent a diplomatic mission to the Abbasid Caliphate to meet with Caliph Mamun, the son of his hero al-Rashid. This mission was led by John the Grammarian and carried all kinds of artistic treasures from Byzantium and 36,000 gold pieces that John was instructed to distribute. I guess in theory, the reason for having so much gold would be to bribe all the officials you would need to get on your side to get a peace agreed to, and to suitably impress the Abbasids that Byzantium was mighty and not to be trifled with. At any rate, John also pulled off a little bit of a ruse where some of the treasures that he had were stolen, meaning he probably just left them in plain sight and let some officials walk off with them, just reported them stolen, pretended he didn't know who did it, and then was able to miraculously reproduce exact copies of those same treasures, which again would have been impressive and shown that the Byzantines were organized, well-led, extraordinarily wealthy, and not to be trifled with. The goal of this mission was to avoid war with the Abbasids and maybe even recruit them as allies in the war against the renegade Muslims who had seized Crete and Sicily. However, as we'll see, this mission was ultimately not successful, and Theophilus would soon find himself at war with the Abbasid Caliphate. When John the Grammarian's mission did not succeed in convincing the Abbasids of Theophilus' point of view, Theophilus resorted to arms, and apparently did so pretty quickly. He invaded the Abbasid Caliphate twice, both in 830 and in 831. In 830, he sacked the city of Zapetra, and then in 831, he attacked Cilicia, which was held by a breakaway group of Muslims who were not directly responsible to the Abbasid Caliphate. He carried away quite a bit of loot from that campaign, and by the time he reached summer, he judged the campaign to be over, and he judged himself worthy of celebrating a triumph for his great achievements. So he decided to do that, and he amassed all of the spoils he had taken and began to march toward Constantinople. Luckily, we have a pretty full description of what occurred at this triumph. Theophilus and his family met for about 10 days on the eastern banks of the Bosporus while they were waiting for all of their spoils to arrive and build up an impressive display. So I guess he would have had some time to catch up with his family. And then they crossed over into Europe, and they entered the Golden Gate to the west of the city. Theophilus was seated on a white charger with a jeweled harness. He had his crown, his scepter, his gold tunic, and he was accompanied by his son-in-law, Caesar Alexius, who was similarly attired. Interestingly enough, Caesar Alexius, I don't believe, shows up at any other point in the historical record, so he is a surprisingly minor character. Both the emperor and his Caesar were given golden crowns by the civil authorities, and there was a ceremonial resumption of authority in Constantinople. Then Theophilus took up a golden throne near the Chowki Palace, while he displayed a new golden organ called the Prime Miracle, so this would have been a fantastically expensive musical instrument. And then he received various awards from the Blues and Greens, the main circus factions in Constantinople. The next day, Theophilus awarded all of the soldiers who had distinguished themselves in the campaign and presided over the triumphal games. If you'll recall, every triumph was followed by athletic contests, which were originally intended to honor the gods, but in a Byzantine context, this was just a tradition that had no direct justification. But it was still fun and boosted public morale, so everybody was down for the games. Despite the fact that Theophilus loved all things Arab and that he had greatly admired the former Abbasid Caliph, he apparently didn't really understand how large empires that were decentralized, like the Abbasid Caliphate, operated. And he certainly didn't understand that for a large empire that was decentralized, it took a long time for an army to mobilize and react to a minor invasion. And this knowledge, or lack thereof, came back to bite him in the ass. So in the autumn of 831, after Theophilus had withdrawn his army and was fresh off of his grand triumph, the Abbasids struck back, and they invaded Byzantine territory. Since Theophilus was in no way prepared for this invasion, he lost several key frontier fortresses in a very short amount of time. Theophilus panicked, and he was forced to beg for peace. He offered 100,000 gold dinars and the return of 7,000 prisoners that he had taken in exchange for the lost fortresses and a 5-year truce. However, the offer was rejected. As you might imagine, Mamun was pretty pissed off about what Theophilus had done previously, and also, he was winning. Why would he give up now? Theophilus was clearly in a bad spot if he went from celebrating a triumph to begging for peace. So Mamun decided to keep fighting. In early 832, Mamun's forces were able to capture the northern end of the Cilician Gates, and more or less had an open path to the Byzantine heartland. Theophilus probably once again was trying to negotiate, but at this point he would have been on the spot with his army, and he would have been actively campaigning. Mamun, however, was bent on winning a total victory that would eclipse anything that his father al-Rashid had accomplished. And his demands were that the Byzantine Empire and Theophilus himself would have to convert to Islam if they wanted to end the war without it ending in a complete and total conquest. So Theophilus, naturally, as you might imagine, did not accept that offer, and continued to fight on, looking for a way to reverse his fortunes. From 832 into 833, Theophilus and Mamun continued to fight each other, but there were no major developments, and Byzantium remained threatened, but undefeated. And then Theophilus got the biggest stroke of luck he would get during his entire reign, because Mamun fell dead of natural causes while on campaign in August of 833. And what this did was it led to a truce, and it gave the emperor some significant breathing room, since what happened is that Mamun's brother Mutasim decided to claim the throne despite the fact that Mamun had a living adult son. And naturally this led to a civil war in the Abbasid lands, and meant that the Abbasids could not invade Byzantine territory. So during the 3 or 4 years after Mamun's death, Theophilus was able to restore the strength of his army and build up his fortifications. It's probably to this period when we should date a lot of Theophilus's reforms to the themes of the East, which we'll get into later. In 837, Mutasim had secured the throne, and he was ready to reinitiate hostilities with the Byzantine world. However, he found that Theophilus had used his time well, and that the Byzantine forces were well prepared for war. Theophilus took the initiative and launched raids into Mesopotamia and western Armenia. And by the way, during this period, Byzantine armies raiding Mesopotamia was not a common thing. so this would have probably been a bit of a shock for the Abbasids. And these raids were pretty successful, and it led Theophilus to believe that he had earned a second triumph for his military brilliance and accomplishments. So once again, he went to Constantinople loaded down with spoils, and this time he topped his first triumph because during the triumphal games he himself competed as a chariot racer. And not surprisingly, he won. He represented the Blues, and all the other drivers stayed behind him deliberately and made sure that he won, and won big. And when he won this rigged race, the crowd actually greeted him with the words, "Welcome, champion incomparable." And for Theophilus, whose last triumph had then ended with a humiliating defeat, this must have seemed like redemption, and this was probably the high point of his career. Another quick point, though, on the idea of the race being rigged. This was a tradition dating back to the earliest emperors of Rome. Caligula, Nero especially. Nero liked to compete in athletic contests, even though he wasn't an athlete. And he also liked to compete in singing contests. And no matter how terrible he was, people would let him win. If he fell out of his chariot, everybody else would stop until he'd gotten back in and built up a lead. So this was not something that Theophilus invented, and it doesn't necessarily point to megalomania or anything of that nature on his part. He was actually just following a tradition, but it's still kind of a ridiculous tradition. So, anyway, back to the story. Whatever Theophilus's virtues may have been, when it came to prematurely ending campaigns and celebrating before things had been settled, he clearly hadn't learned his lesson. In April of 838, Mutasim gathered an army of 50,000 men, and his purpose was purely punitive. He was going to drive beyond the Byzantine frontiers into the heartland and destroy the imperial family's seat at Amorium. The two rulers clashed at the city of Dazimon, also known as Anzan, today's Tokat, and they fought a major battle here. Now, obviously, Dazimon was quite a bit to the east of Amorium, so Theophilus was near the frontier. He had gotten his army back in time, and he was clearly interested in not allowing his family seat to fall to the Abbasids. They fought a major battle here, and at first the Byzantines were winning. It looks like the military reforms that Theophilus had undertaken were working well. But then a heavy rain broke out, and while Theophilus was winning, he decided that one of his wings was in trouble, so he removed 2,000 men from the front line and tried to move them around the rest of his army to get to that threatened wing. However, for whatever reason, he didn't send messengers to his other commanders to inform them of what he was doing. So when the other forces saw some of his men falling back, they assumed that Theophilus had been killed and that all was lost. So things went to shit really quickly. So as I mentioned, when Theophilus withdrew his 2,000 men and didn't explain his intentions, his men, who were already probably a bit unsettled by the heavy rains, thought that instead of the battle going to them, everything was lost because Theophilus must have been cut down, and now they were on the verge of being overrun, so a large portion of the army just melted away. Theophilus, of course, didn't know that he had died, and his unit stayed together. And the next thing they know, they're surrounded by the Abbasid army, with their own army now off the field. Now, one good thing about the heavy rains for Theophilus is that the Abbasid archers couldn't really do their thing because their bowstrings were too wet to function. So they couldn't just shoot down all of Theophilus's outnumbered men. Theophilus was then able to gather his men together, form a tight knot, and break out, and then escape west. However, he was only able to do this while incurring heavy losses. And after the Battle of Dazimon, Theophilus' army was too reduced and too demoralized for more general engagements. They would have needed more time to get their shit back together. So this means that now Caliph Mutasim has a clear line on his target, the city of Amorium. While on the march to Amorium, Mutasim marched first to the city of Ankara, which is modern Ankara, the capital of Turkey. And that city, which was also pretty important, surrendered after a few days. They weren't expecting to be under siege. They weren't on the frontier. And, they weren't expecting Theophilus' army to randomly panic during a rainstorm. And who can blame them? That's sort of something that'd be hard to predict. Anyway, then Mutasim marched on to Amorium. Now, it was well known that this was his intention, and the city thought that it was prepared. The residents were ready to fight it out, and they knew that because it was his ancestral home, that Theophilus would get the army back together and march to their rescue. So everyone was ready for what was going to happen, and there was even a possibility that if the siege didn't work very well, that Theophilus might be able to catch Mutasim napping and return the favor from Dazimon. But, unfortunately, this is where Theophilus gets his worst stroke of luck in his regime. So, there was a section of the city wall that was in disrepair. And, a lot of the defenders didn't seem to be aware of it, and certainly the Caliph couldn't have known about it, except that there was a converted Muslim resident of Amorium who spoke with the Caliph and told Mutasim all about it. So, Mutasim decided to concentrate his catapults on that section of the wall that created a breach. There was a very fierce battle inside of the walls. Ultimately, the Abbasids were victorious, and they burned most of the town's surviving residents in a church where they had taken refuge. So Amorium was almost literally wiped off the map. All but 42 people in the city died. And you might be asking, how do we know the precise number of people who survived? How do we know that it was exactly 42? Well, because these 42 people ended up becoming rather famous. They are known as the 42 Martyrs of Amorium. So these 42 people were relocated to Samaria, and they resided there in captivity for 7 years. On March 6, 845, these 42 Amorians were given the choice to convert to Islam or die, and all of them chose to die. And for this action, for becoming martyrs, these 42 people are still honored by the Greek Orthodox Church to this day. As you might imagine, for Theophilus and all of the powers that be in the Byzantine world, the fall of Amorium was a shock. It was unexpected, and it really shouldn't have happened. Not to mention that the brutality of it was also not anticipated. So this meant that Theophilus decided to change up his strategy accordingly. So one thing that he did was immediately open negotiations with Emperor Louis the Pious in the west to begin launching coordinated attacks on Arab holdings. The idea that Theophilus had was to allow Louis to hit Sicily while he sent forces to reclaim Crete and continued to fight it out in Asia Minor, as the Byzantines had been doing for a couple centuries. And apparently Theophilus also envisioned that the two forces could link up and then push into Egypt. Many people have called this the precursor to the Crusades, that maybe what Theophilus had in mind was something not unlike the Crusades, a Christian versus Muslim war. At any rate, it's not clear if that was the rhetoric behind it, or if his motives were more strategic, or exactly what went into the thinking. We do know, however, that Theophilus intended for this alliance to be sealed by a union of Theophilus' daughter and Louis' grandson. The negotiations opened in June of 839, and they continued for 4 years until they were cancelled and both rulers had perished. And this is a picture of Louis the Pious, where he looks like Butthead. Anyway, Theophilus also tried unsuccessfully to appeal to the newly recognized Venetian Republic for help, and they also were unwilling or unable to contribute much meaningful help. You would think that after his great victory in 838 at Dazimon and then at Amorium, that Mutasim would be eager to follow up these campaigns with more deep strikes into Byzantine territory. However, he apparently was preoccupied elsewhere, or else was willing and able to rest on his laurels. At any rate, by early 842, Mutasim decided to revive an old tactic of the Caliphate and launch a naval expedition directly against the Byzantine capital at Constantinople. And for this task, he amassed 400 ships in Syria and sent them off. Unfortunately for Mutasim, his sailors would meet the fate of so many other galley top-heavy fleets. And that fate is to be completely destroyed by a freak storm. So of the 400 ships that were dispatched, 7 of them survived, and the rest were smashed somewhere, probably still in Abbasid territory. And luckily for Mutasim, I guess you could say, he died without knowing that his last great effort had become a complete and total boondoggle. He died on January 5th of 842, and he was unaware that his last effort at defeating Byzantium had been a complete waste of manpower and resources. As for Theophilus, he actually died not long thereafter on January 20th of 842 of dysentery, and he may not have known about the fleet or its destruction at the time of his death, or maybe that was the last piece of news he ever received. At any rate, hard to know. And, of course, this brings to an end the account of the events of Theophilus's reign in chronological order, but there are other things that we need to talk about that can't really be placed into a clear chronology, so we'll just discuss them as they come up. Earlier in this video, I alluded to Theophilus having made military reforms, and these reforms were most likely made between his 2 wars with the Abbasids. So most likely these reforms took place primarily between 833 and 837. At any rate, the first project that Theophilus embarked on was to complete his father's work in heightening and strengthening the walls at the Golden Horn. If you'll recall, Thomas the Slav had almost captured Constantinople because the seaborne fortifications at the Golden Horn were a bit weak. So Michael and his son Theophilus spent quite a bit of time and energy correcting that problem. Now, on to what Theophilus did in the East. So there he created 3 new Eastern themes. Most likely this was to weaken the authority of the Strategoi and make them less likely to revolt, but also to give them more manageable, smaller commands and make things a little more flexible. In addition to those 3 new themes, he also created 3 new Kleserai, or defensive districts, and these were along the eastern frontier, so these may have been more or less purely military districts, whereas a theme was not. And these districts apparently proved to be pretty successful. Arguably, Theophilus was only able and willing to perform these reforms because he had met with some failure, and he knew that the East was vulnerable. In the long run, these reforms proved to be beneficial, and they helped to enhance the empire's long-term security. So this is something that Theophilus has going for him, even if he was not the greatest battlefield commander or judge of when a campaign is actually over. In one of my early sections in this video, I mentioned that it is a bit mysterious that Theophilus was an iconoclast, but one who was not hammered by the sources for his iconoclasm. So let's talk about that. Theophilus was the last major iconoclast, and certainly the last emperor who endorsed a persecution on the issue of icons. Given that Theophilus only really punished prominent iconodules, and only on an infrequent basis, this suggests that he was acting for political reasons to appease some part of his populace. It doesn't appear to be something that he cared about all that much. And in fact, he knew that his wife, the Empress Theodora, and her mother were both ardent and practicing iconophiles. Both of them had icons in their personal chambers. Theophilus had to be aware of this, and apparently he didn't care. But for whatever reason, he still persisted with persecuting a few token people here and there for their veneration of icons. Let's look at this last iconoclast persecution in detail. So this persecution actually didn't start until about the middle of Theophilus's reign. So what happened is the patriarch had died in 837, and Theophilus chose his old tutor, John the Grammarian, to be the new patriarch. And both of these men were iconoclasts. It might be where Theophilus got his conviction, was from his teacher. And they decided to reinstitute the persecution of iconodules, and they decided to aim it especially at monks. And maybe this is because monks tended to be people who opposed the traditional power structure and it may have been more politically motivated than anything else. Really hard to say at this remove. Two Palestinian monks were prominent at the time as defenders of icons, Theodore and Theophanes. They were brought to Constantinople, and then they were branded with iconoclast verse on their forehead, and this made them be known as groptoi, those who were written on. One of these brothers died, possibly in a way that was exacerbated by the wounds that he received from this, but one of the other ones went on to become a bishop of a major city, so apparently he was no worse for the wear. And if anything, it would have made him something of a hero to stand up for his beliefs and then have those beliefs be validated and accepted by everyone. There was also the instance of the icon painter Lazarus, whose palms were branded by Theophilus' agents, but apparently he also was not hurt too badly, and he was later able to produce two major icons, including one that went over the Chowkey Gate that replaced the one that had been destroyed by Leo back in the day. Earlier, we talked about how Theophilus was a big fan of display and ostentation, and that he was very good at presenting magnificence to the public. Well, let's talk about some specific examples that he accomplished over the course of his reign. So, one project that he was probably very proud of was his renovation of the Great Palace Complex. This had been built originally by Constantine I and last renovated by Justinian I. So not only was it overdue for a renovation, but by renovating it, he was able to put himself in the same category as two emperors who had the appellation the Great. And no doubt Theophilus probably thought of himself as being one of the men who deserved the title the Great. He also added the triple shell and the Hall of the Pearl to the Great Palace Complex, and I'm not entirely sure what these are, but I know that they're made of very expensive materials like porphyry, so this was apparently very impressive. He also added mechanical lions and birds near the throne at the Palace of the Magnara near the Hagia Sophia, and these would all make noises when ambassadors would approach and leave the palace. So this was considered to be something of a marvel. However, these animatronic things, or whatever you want to call them, mechanical animals, were really inspired by Abbasid technology, and this is one of the examples of how Theophilus modeled himself after the Abbasid rulers and took some of his inspirations from them. In addition to his close relationship with John the Grammarian, who was one of the greatest scholars of that time, Theophilus also had dealings with Leo the Mathematician, who was an internationally famous scholar and polymath. Leo's interests really were all over the place. He was interested in mechanics, ancient literature, theology, and, not surprisingly, mathematics. At one point, Leo was about to go to the court of Caliph Mamun when he was invited. However, Theophilus didn't want to lose this acclaimed scholar and wanted to keep him as an ornament of his and the Byzantine Empire's greatness. So instead, he refused to let Leo go and set him up as a teacher at public expense in one of the main churches of the capital. So this would really help set the precedent of Byzantine rulers serving as patrons of the art and of encouraging things like education and learning. So this would be yet another credit to Theophilus, since it made him look like someone who was broad-minded and really cared for the well-being of his city and the preparation of its ruling class. As I've mentioned several times, Theophilus is one of those figures about whom legends are told. And none of those legends quite encapsulates why he was so beloved better than this one. This time, he was a defender of a common person against someone who was not only powerful, but closely connected with himself. So, at one point, Theophilus was approached by an elderly widow who complained that the emperor's own brother-in-law, Patronus, was enlarging his palace in a way that made it block out all of the sunlight from her house. Theophilus investigated her claims and found them to be true, And to rectify the situation, he ordered Patronus to tear down the structures responsible for blocking the sunlight, and then had Patronus flogged in public for his insolence and the abuse that he put on to this widow. Now, I presume, but I don't know for sure, that the widow had approached Patronus about this issue, and he probably blew her off and said, well, I'm powerful and important, and you're no one, so I'll do as I please. And Theophilus stood up for her right to have sunlight. So, something like that, if it's true, would really make someone like Theophilus very popular, because it would mean that he is consistent and someone who stands for justice. And if so, we can see why people mourned his death for so many years, and why so many citizens who had either lived through his reign or else had heard about him from their parents or grandparents would have really wondered how great it would be to live under someone like Theophilus again. On January 20th, 842, Theophilus died at the age of 38 of dysentery. This left the empire in the hands of his 3-year-old son, Michael III, and his widow, Theodora. Theophilus is hard to assess as an emperor because a lot of what we know about him is more the legend than the man. We know also that it looks like his legend was embellished a fair amount after his death, and that he became something of a folk hero and a rallying cry. His military reforms were legitimate, and they definitely served to benefit the empire in the East to some extent. One thing that's interesting about Theophilus is that his perceived greatness and untapped potential make him quite a bit like the Byzantine equivalent of JFK, as I've commented before. He's someone who has this aura about him, and while he did have some legitimate achievements, it's mostly just the idea that he was someone who was capable of achieving things, rather than that he had a laundry list of accomplishments. I would say that he is separated from the ranks of the truly great emperors mostly because he really didn't have the ability to judge when campaigns were over or when enemies were sufficiently beaten. He made the same mistake twice against the same enemy, and that was a pretty grievous error in judgment. By that point, he was a relatively mature and experienced ruler, and he really should have known better. That being said, certainly we've seen far, far worse emperors, and we're about to see another one when we look at the reign of his son Michael III, who earned the not very flattering sobriquet of the Drunk.